The frigid winter wind howled through the cracks of the small cabin as Beatrice Calloway coughed weakly in the silence, her fevered brow glistening in the dim lantern light. Xavier Frost hadn't slept properly in 3 days, his weathered cowboy hat resting on the nightstand beside her bed as he watched over her, determined that this stranger who'd collapsed near his property wouldn't die on his watch. The year was 1878, and the unforgiving Montana Territory had claimed many lives before their time. Xavier wasn't about to let it take another if he could help it. "Water," Beatrice whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Her once vibrant auburn hair lay matted against the pillow, her skin nearly as pale as the fresh snow outside. Xavier reached for the tin cup on the nightstand, gently lifting her head to help her drink. "Easy now, miss, just small sips." Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of summer sage, a stark contrast to her sickly complexion. "Who are you?" she asked, confusion clouding her gaze. "Name's Xavier Frost. Found you half frozen in the snow about a mile from my cabin 3 days ago. You've been fighting a mighty fierce fever since then." He adjusted the cool cloth on her forehead. "Mind telling me what a lady like yourself was doing out in these parts alone during the worst blizzard we've seen in years?" Another coughing fit seized her before she could respond, her entire body shaking with the effort. Xavier steadied her shoulders until the spasm passed, worry etching deeper lines into his already weathered face. At 32, he'd seen his fair share of hardship on the frontier, but something about this woman's plight stirred something long dormant within him. When her breathing steadied, Beatrice attempted to speak again. "I was traveling to Helena. The stagecoach broke an axle. Thought I could make it to the next station on foot." A bitter smile crossed her cracked lips. "Clearly, I was wrong." Xavier nodded, understanding her desperate gamble. The stagecoach lines were notoriously unreliable in winter, and passengers were often left to fend for themselves when troubles arose. "That's 10 miles at least. You're lucky to be alive, miss. Calloway, Beatrice Calloway." She closed her eyes briefly, the effort of conversation clearly taxing her depleted strength. Xavier rose from his chair beside her bed, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the rough-hewn floorboards. "Well, Miss Calloway, you need rest more than talk. I've sent word to Doc Sullivan in town, but with the snow as deep as it is, it might be a few days before he can make it out here." "Why are you helping me?" Her question was direct, her eyes suddenly sharp despite her illness. Xavier paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. It was a fair question. In these parts, strangers were often met with suspicion rather than kindness. "My ma taught me never to turn away someone in need. Besides," he added with a hint of a smile, "it gets mighty lonely out here in winter. Even fever-addled company is better than none." The honesty in his words seemed to satisfy her, and Beatrice relaxed against the pillows. "Thank you, Mr. Frost." "Xavier," he corrected. "Mr. Frost was my father, and I never much cared for him anyway." A ghost of a smile touched her lips before her eyes drifted closed again, sleep claiming her once more. Xavier watched her for a moment, noting how even in illness there was a quiet dignity about her. Whatever had brought Beatrice Calloway to this remote corner of Montana, he suspected there was more to her story than a simple journey gone awry. Xavier moved to the main room of his modest cabin and stoked the fire, adding several logs to ensure it would burn through the night. The blizzard still raged outside, the wind screaming around the eaves like a banshee. He'd need to check on the livestock in the barn soon, make sure they were weathering the storm all right. As he pulled on his heavy coat and reached for his hat, he found himself pausing to look back at the partially open bedroom door. Something about the woman troubled him, not in a way that suggested danger, but rather mystery. Her clothes, though travel-worn, were of fine quality. Her speech was educated, her manner refined despite her desperate condition. She was no ordinary frontier woman, that much was clear. Xavier shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside as he braced himself for the biting cold outside. Whatever Beatrice Calloway's story was, it would have to wait until her fever broke. The next morning dawned clear and blindingly bright, the storm having passed in the night. Xavier had slept poorly in his chair by the fire, waking every hour to check on his patient. To his relief, Beatrice's fever seemed less severe, though she still drifted in and out of consciousness. After tending to his small herd of cattle and 2 horses, Xavier returned to the cabin with fresh eggs from the chicken coop. As he prepared a simple breakfast, he heard movement from the bedroom. "Mr. Frost, Xavier?" Beatrice's voice was stronger today, though still ragged around the edges. He quickly wiped his hands and moved to the doorway. "You're awake. How are you feeling?" Beatrice was attempting to sit up, her face flushed with effort rather than fever. "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo, but I believe the worst has passed." She managed to prop herself against the headboard, her breathing labored from even this small exertion. "What day is it?" "Tuesday." "You've been here 4 nights now." Xavier approached cautiously, noting how her hands trembled as she tried to smooth her tangled hair. "Are you hungry? I was just making breakfast." A look of embarrassment crossed her face as she glanced down at herself. This isn't my nightgown." Xavier felt a flush creeping up his neck. "No, madam, your clothes were soaked through when I found you. I had to. Well, I tried to be respectful. The nightgown was my sister's. She stayed here sometimes before she got married and moved to Oregon." Beatrice nodded, seemingly satisfied with his explanation. "Thank you, and yes, I find I'm actually quite hungry." "Good sign," Xavier said, relieved to change the subject. "I'll bring you some eggs and coffee." When he returned with the modest meal, Beatrice had managed to arrange the blankets more modestly around herself. He set the tray across her lap and retreated to the chair by the bed. "You don't need to watch me eat," she said, the corners of her mouth twitching upward. "I promise not to choke or faint into my plate." Xavier smiled, surprised by her humor. "Force of habit, I suppose. Been watching you pretty carefully these past few days." Beatrice took a small bite of eggs, closing her eyes briefly as she savored the simple food. "These are delicious." "I don't think I realized how hungry I was. Fever takes a lot out of a body." Xavier studied her, noting the healthy color returning to her cheeks. "If you don't mind my asking, Miss Calloway, what business did you have in Helena?" Not many women travel alone through these territories, especially in winter. Her fork paused midway to her mouth, and a guarded expression replaced her earlier openness. "I was to meet my fiancé there. He has mining interests in the area." Xavier nodded, trying to ignore the unexpected twinge of disappointment at the word fiancé. Of course a woman like Beatrice would be spoken for. "He must be worried sick about you. Once the trail clears a bit, I can ride into town and send a telegram." "That won't be necessary." Beatrice set down her fork, her appetite seemingly diminished. "Richard isn't expecting me until the end of the month. I was traveling ahead of schedule." There was something in her tone that gave Xavier pause, but he knew better than to press. Everyone in these parts had their secrets, their reasons for being where they were. "Well, you're welcome to stay here until you're strong enough to travel. The next stagecoach won't come through for at least 2 weeks anyway, with the passes snowed in like they are." Relief flickered across her face before she composed herself again. "You're very kind. I'll find a way to repay your hospitality." "No need," Xavier assured her. "Just focus on getting better." The next several days fell into an unexpected rhythm. As Beatrice's strength slowly returned, she began to spend more time sitting in Xavier's small living area, wrapped in blankets near the fire. Though still weak, her persistent cough gradually subsided, and her natural vitality began to emerge. Xavier found himself increasingly drawn to her company. Beatrice was well-read and articulate, often entertaining him with discussions of books he'd only heard of but never read. In the evenings, she would listen attentively as he shared stories of his 10 years on the frontier, tales of cattle drives, encounters with indigenous tribes, and the harsh beauty of the untamed wilderness. "How did you end up here, so far from everything?" Beatrice asked one evening as they shared a simple stew. She'd insisted on helping prepare the meal, though Xavier had limited her contribution to cutting vegetables while seated at the table. Xavier considered the question as he added another log to the fire. After the war, there wasn't much left for me back east. My family's farm in Pennsylvania was struggling, and I'd seen enough during my time with the Union Army to know I needed open spaces and quiet. He settled back into his chair. Came out here with my sister and her husband initially. They moved on to Oregon after a couple of years, but something about this land got under my skin. Couldn't imagine being anywhere else now. Beatrice nodded thoughtfully. I understand the appeal of a fresh start. And you, Xavier ventured. You don't strike me as someone who's spent much time in frontier towns. A shadow passed over her face. No, I was raised in Boston. My father was a merchant with shipping interests. She hesitated, twisting the simple silver ring on her right hand. He died last year. That's when everything changed. Xavier waited, sensing there was more to the story but unwilling to push her boundaries. After a moment, Beatrice continued, her voice softer. Richard, my fiancé, was my father's business partner. The arrangement was convenient for all involved. She looked up, meeting Xavier's gaze directly. I'm sure you've deduced by now that I wasn't simply traveling ahead of schedule. I figured there was more to it, Xavier admitted, though it's not my place to ask. 3 days before our wedding, I discovered some discrepancies in my father's accounts, papers that suggested Richard had been systematically embezzling from the company for years. Her hands tightened around her cup. When I confronted him, he was not the man I thought I knew. I feared for my safety, so I took what evidence I could find and fled. Xavier felt a surge of protective anger. He threatened you, not directly, but the look in his eyes. She shuddered slightly. I've been traveling westward for nearly 2 months, staying in one place never longer than a few days. I had heard of Helena's newly established federal court and thought perhaps I could find justice there. And now, do you still plan to go to Helena? Beatrice's expression hardened with determination. I must, not just for my father's legacy, but because I believe Richard has defrauded others as well, people who trusted him. Xavier nodded slowly. That's a dangerous path you're on, Miss Calloway. Beatrice, she corrected with a small smile. If I'm to call you Xavier, you should use my given name as well. Beatrice, he repeated, savoring the way it felt on his tongue. That night, as Xavier lay on his makeshift bed by the fire, having insisted Beatrice continue to use the bedroom, he found himself turning over her story in his mind. The thought of her facing such dangers alone troubled him deeply. Helena was a growing city, but still rough around the edges. A woman alone, pursuing charges against a powerful businessman, would face considerable obstacles and potential threats. By morning, Xavier had made a decision. When Beatrice emerged from the bedroom, her hair neatly braided and wearing one of the clean dresses he'd managed to procure from a neighbor's wife, he presented his proposition. I'm riding to Helena with you, he stated simply, pouring her a cup of coffee. Beatrice looked up in surprise. That's not necessary. You've already done far more than it's not up for debate, Xavier interrupted gently. Winter travel is dangerous enough without adding the fact that someone might be looking for you. Besides, he added with a slight smile, I have business in Helena myself. What business? She asked skeptically. Supplies, banking, things that need tending to. The excuses sounded flimsy even to his own ears, but Xavier held her gaze steadily. Truth is, I'd not rest easy knowing you were facing this alone. Beatrice studied him for a long moment, emotions playing across her expressive face, gratitude, hesitation, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Finally, she nodded. Thank you, I would welcome the company. Over the next week, Beatrice's strength continued to improve, though Xavier insisted they wait until she could ride comfortably before attempting the journey to Helena. He taught her basic riding skills, leading his gentlest mare, Daisy, around the cleared area near the cabin while Beatrice gradually adjusted to being in the saddle. I feel ridiculous, she admitted after nearly losing her balance during one of their practice sessions. Women in Boston don't typically straddle horses like this. Xavier steadied her with a hand on her elbow, trying to ignore the warmth that spread through him at the brief contact. Side saddles are fine for city parks, but they'll get you killed on mountain trails. You're doing well for a beginner. The praise brought a flush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with exertion. "You're a patient teacher." As they worked together preparing for the journey, Xavier found himself increasingly aware of Beatrice's presence, the graceful way she moved, the musical quality of her laugh when he told one of his admittedly poor jokes, the thoughtful furrow that appeared between her brows when she concentrated on a task. For her part, Beatrice seemed to be studying him just as carefully. He would occasionally catch her watching him as he chopped wood or tended to the animals, her expression contemplative. In the evenings, their conversations grew deeper, moving beyond polite exchanges to genuine sharing of thoughts, fears, and dreams. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" she asked one night as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside like a mournful ghost. Xavier considered the question seriously. "Yes," he finally admitted, "there's a piece to this life that I cherish, but there are times when the silence grows too heavy." He poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. "What about you? Did you have many friends in Boston?" "Acquaintances, mostly. My father was protective after my mother died, and I spent much of my youth in boarding schools." Beatrice traced an absent pattern on the arm of her chair. "I think that's why I agreed to the engagement with Richard so readily. I was lonely and he was attentive." "You deserve better than attention," Xavier said quietly. "You deserve someone who sees your true worth." Their eyes met across the small space, and for a breathless moment, something electric passed between them. Beatrice was the first to look away, but the slight trembling of her fingers as she reached for her tea betrayed her composure. 2 weeks after Beatrice had first opened her eyes in Xavier's cabin, they set out for Helena. The snow had compacted enough to make travel possible, though Xavier warned it would still be a challenging 3-day journey. He had prepared meticulously, packing supplies on his sturdy pack horse and making arrangements for a neighbor to look after his livestock in his absence. Beatrice wore men's trousers beneath her skirt for riding, a practical compromise that had initially scandalized her, but which she now appreciated as they navigated the rugged terrain. Xavier had also insisted she wear his spare coat, lined with sheepskin and far warmer than her city garments. "You look like a proper frontierswoman now," he teased as they set out, the morning sun casting long shadows across the pristine snow. Beatrice straightened in her saddle, affecting a serious expression. "Does that mean you'll stop treating me like I might break at any moment?" Xavier laughed, the sound echoing in the crisp air. "Not a chance, Boston." The nickname had emerged naturally between them, and Beatrice found she didn't mind it coming from him. It felt like a private joke rather than a reminder of all she'd left behind. Their first day on the trail passed without incident. Xavier set a careful pace, mindful of Beatrice's still recovering health and limited riding experience. They stopped frequently to rest, and he pointed out landmarks and wildlife as they traveled, sharing his intimate knowledge of the land. As dusk approached, Xavier led them to a small clearing sheltered by a rocky outcropping. "We'll camp here tonight," he announced, dismounting smoothly and moving to help Beatrice down from her horse. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, and Beatrice found herself staring up at him, suddenly aware of how close they stood. The scent of pine and leather surrounded him, now familiar and comforting to her. Xavier cleared his throat and stepped back. "I'll get a fire going." "You should rest." While he tended to the horses and gathered firewood, Beatrice arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of where the fire would be. The domestic nature of the task struck her suddenly, how natural it felt to work alongside this man she'd known for such a short time, yet who had become so important to her. "Something troubling you?" Xavier asked as he returned with an armful of wood, clearly noticing her pensive mood. Beatrice shook her head. "Just thinking about how quickly life can change. A month ago, I was preparing for a wedding in Boston. Now I'm camping in the Montana wilderness with a cowboy I barely know, running from one life toward an uncertain future." Xavier arranged the wood and set about starting the fire. "Regrets? No," she answered without hesitation. "Fear, yes. Uncertainty, absolutely, but not regret." She watched as the first flames caught the kindling. "Meeting you has been the one fortunate thing in this whole ordeal." The firelight illuminated his face as he looked up at her, his expression unguarded for once. "The fortune was mine, Beatrice." They ate a simple dinner of jerky, biscuits, and coffee, sitting close to the fire as the temperature dropped with nightfall. Xavier shared stories of his first winter in Montana, how unprepared he'd been for the brutal cold, and how a local Blackfoot family had taught him survival skills that had saved his life more than once. "They taught me to respect this land, not just survive on it," he explained. "Changed how I see everything." "You speak of them with such reverence," Beatrice observed. "It's different from how most settlers talk about the indigenous people." Xavier's expression darkened. "Most settlers haven't bothered to know them as people. After what I saw in the war, how easily men convince themselves that other men aren't really human, I promised myself I'd never fall into that kind of thinking again." Beatrice reached across the space between them and placed her hand on his. "Your heart does you credit, Xavier Frost." He turned his hand to clasp hers, rough calluses against her softer skin. "Get some rest, Boston. Tomorrow's a longer day." That night, as Beatrice lay wrapped in her bedroll and extra blankets, she found herself watching Xavier across the dying embers of the fire. Even in sleep, there was a vigilance about him, one hand near the rifle that lay beside him. She wondered about the experiences that had shaped him, the losses and triumphs that had carved the lines around his eyes and the occasional sadness in his smile. Sometime in the night, the temperature plummeted further, and Beatrice woke shivering violently despite her layers. Xavier was immediately alert, crossing to her side with a worried expression. "Your cough's coming back," he noted, hearing the wheeze in her breath. Without hesitation, he dragged his bedroll next to hers. "Body heat," he explained simply. "It's how you survive out here." Beatrice was too cold to protest as he settled beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders and pulling her against the solid warmth of his chest. She should have felt scandalized by such intimacy with a man who wasn't her husband, but instead she felt only security and comfort. "Better," he murmured near her ear. "Yes," she whispered back, gradually relaxing as warmth returned to her limbs. "Thank you." She fell asleep listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, more content than she'd felt in years. Morning brought awkward awareness as they disentangled themselves, both mumbling apologies and avoiding direct eye contact as they packed up camp. The easy camaraderie of the previous day seemed temporarily strained, though neither acknowledged the change. As they rode through increasingly difficult terrain, Beatrice found herself watching Xavier's broad shoulders ahead of her, remembering the strength and gentleness of his embrace. She had never experienced such conflicting emotions: gratitude, confusion, and an undeniable attraction that grew stronger with each passing day. By midday, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, and Xavier's expression grew concerned as he studied the sky. "We need to find better shelter than I planned," he announced. "That's a bad storm brewing, and we're still a good day's ride from the next settlement." Beatrice felt a flutter of anxiety. "What options do we have?" Xavier pointed to a distant ridge. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 hours from here if we push hard. Not much, but solid walls and a roof." They rode at a faster pace, the horses sensing the urgency as the wind began to pick up. Beatrice's muscles ached from the unaccustomed exertion, but she gritted her teeth and kept up, determined not to slow them down. The first fat snowflakes were beginning to fall when they finally reached the abandoned cabin. It was little more than a single room with a stone fireplace, its windows covered with oilcloth rather than glass, but to Beatrice, it looked like salvation. Xavier quickly tended to the horses in the crude lean to attach to one side of the cabin while Beatrice assessed their temporary shelter. Years of disuse had left it dusty and home to various small creatures, but the roof was intact and the chimney seemed clear. By the time Xavier joined her inside, Beatrice had swept out the worst of the debris and was attempting to start a fire with the limited dry wood stored beside the hearth. He took over the task with practiced efficiency, soon coaxing flames from the tinder. "Looks like we'll be here at least a day, maybe 2, he said, glancing toward the doorway where snow was now falling heavily. "Storm's moving in faster than I expected." Beatrice tried to hide her disappointment. Every day delayed was another day Richard might discover her whereabouts or move to destroy the evidence she sought to present, but she knew better than to argue with the weather in this unforgiving landscape. "We have enough supplies?" she asked, mentally inventorying their food stores. Xavier nodded. "Enough for a few days, and I can hunt if needed." He gave her an appraising look. "How are you holding up? Truth now, not what you think I want to hear." Beatrice sighed, allowing her shoulders to slump slightly. Tired, sore, a bit anxious about the delay. She managed a small smile. "But alive, thanks to you, again." "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," Xavier replied, his voice gentle. "Not many city women would have survived what you've already endured." The praise warmed her more than it should have. "I've had an excellent guide." As night fell, the storm intensified, wind howling around the cabin's corners and snow accumulating rapidly outside. They shared a meal of dried meat and the last of their fresh bread, sitting close to the fire for warmth. The cabin's single room offered no privacy, and Beatrice became acutely aware of their isolation as Xavier spread their bedrolls near the hearth. Unlike the previous night's emergency arrangement, propriety suggested they should maintain some distance between them. Yet when Xavier finally settled on his bedroll after checking the horses one last time, Beatrice found herself wishing he was closer. The cabin, for all its shelter, felt cavernous and cold away from the fire's immediate warmth. "Xavier," she ventured into the darkness between them. "Yes." His voice came immediately, suggesting he hadn't been close to sleep either. "I never properly thanked you for saving my life." She heard him shift position. "No thanks needed. Anyone would have done the same." "That's not true," Beatrice countered softly. "Most would have done far less, if anything at all." She paused, gathering courage. "You're a good man, Xavier Frost. The best I've ever known, I think." The silence that followed was so complete that Beatrice wondered if she'd offended him somehow. Then she heard movement, and suddenly Xavier was kneeling beside her bedroll, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Beatrice," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I need to say something, and I hope you won't think less of me for it." Her heart quickened. "What is it?" "I know you're running from a broken engagement. I know your heart must be bruised, if not broken. I know it's too soon and probably inappropriate given our circumstances." He took a deep breath. "But I find myself caring for you in a way I didn't expect, in a way I've never felt before." Beatrice sat up slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "My engagement to Richard was a business arrangement, not a love match," she said carefully. "My heart was never his to break." Hope flickered across Xavier's features. "Even so, we've known each other such a short time." "Time measures differently out here, doesn't it?" Beatrice reached out tentatively to touch his cheek. "A week in a sict seems like a lifetime. A day on the trail reveals more of a person's character than years of formal dinners and dance cards." Xavier caught her hand in his, turning it to press a kiss against her palm. The gesture sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. "I don't want to take advantage of your vulnerability," he whispered. Beatrice smiled at that. "You sat by my bedside for days while I was at my worst, and never once made me feel anything but safe and respected. I think we're well past worrying about advantage, don't you?" In answer, Xavier leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. Instead, Beatrice closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that began tentative but quickly deepened into something that made her breathless. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since you first opened those green eyes and asked who I was." Beatrice laughed softly. "Even with me looking half dead and completely disheveled, especially then," he admitted, "you looked like a fighter, and I've always admired strength." They talked late into the night, their bedrolls pushed together now by mutual agreement, though they did nothing more than share occasional kisses and the comfort of each other's arms. Xavier spoke of his dreams for his small ranch, how he hoped to expand his herd and perhaps build a proper house someday. Beatrice shared stories of her childhood, her mother's early death, and her complicated relationship with her driven, often distant father. "What will you do after Helena?" Xavier asked as the fire burned low. If you succeed in bringing Richard to justice, Beatrice considered the question. I'm not sure. I have some funds of my own enough to start over somewhere. I've thought about opening a small school, perhaps. I always enjoyed teaching the younger girls when I was at boarding school. Montana could use good teachers, Xavier suggested, his tone carefully neutral, especially in the smaller settlements. Beatrice turned to face him fully. Xavier Frost, are you asking me to consider staying in Montana? I'm asking you to consider staying with me, he replied, his vulnerability plain on his face. I know it's fast. I know you have options and opportunities far beyond what a simple rancher can offer. But these past weeks with you have shown me what my life could be like with the right partner beside me. Tears pricked at Beatrice's eyes. No one has ever seen me as a partner before. My father saw me as an asset to be managed. Richard saw me as a convenient way to legitimize his control of the business. She traced the strong line of Xavier's jaw. You're the first person who's ever just seen me. Is that a yes? Hope brightened his eyes. It's a let's see what happens in Helena, Beatrice answered honestly. I need to finish what I started. I need justice for my father and the others Richard defrauded. But after that, yes, I would like very much to explore a future with you, Xavier. His smile was worth every hardship she'd endured to reach this moment. The storm lasted through the next day, forcing them to remain in the cabin. They used the time to learn more about each other, sharing stories, hopes, and even fears. Xavier taught Beatrice how to play poker using a worn deck of cards he carried, while she recited poetry from memory that her governess had insisted she learn as a girl. By the second morning, the storm had passed, leaving a transformed landscape of pristine white stretching to the horizon. They set out early, Xavier breaking trail through the deep snow with his horse while Beatrice followed in his path. The journey to Helena took another 2 days, the snow slowing their progress considerably. They spent one more night camping beneath the stars, now openly sharing a bedroll for warmth and comfort, though Xavier remained respectful of boundaries Beatrice hadn't yet invited him to cross. As they crested the final ridge and Helena came into view in the valley below, Beatrice felt a complicated mix of emotions. The town represented both the culmination of her desperate flight from Boston and, potentially, the beginning of something new and precious with the man beside her. Having second thoughts? Xavier asked, noting her pensive expression. Beatrice straightened her shoulders. No, I've come too far to turn back now, but I am concerned about what awaits us down there. Whatever it is, we'll face it together, Xavier promised, reaching across to squeeze her gloved hand. They rode into Helena in the late afternoon, the bustling mining town a shock after the solitude of their journey. Buildings lined the main street, many hastily constructed of raw lumber, others more substantial with brick facades declaring their permanence. Saloons and mercantiles did brisk business despite the cold, and wagons navigated the slushy streets carrying supplies and ore. Xavier led them to a modest hotel on a side street, one he assured Beatrice was respectable but not so prominent that her presence would be widely noted. Best to keep a low profile until we know more about the situation, he explained as he secured 2 adjoining rooms. The proprietress, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Daniels, looked askance at Beatrice's travel-worn appearance but softened when Xavier explained she was his cousin, recently recovered from illness and in need of rest. Once settled in her room, which seemed luxuriously private after their shared journey, Beatrice allowed herself a moment of doubt. The evidence she carried might not be enough. Richard had powerful connections, even out west. She was risking not only her own future, but now Xavier's as well by involving him in her quest. A soft knock at the connecting door interrupted her worried thoughts. "Come in," she called, smoothing her hair self-consciously. Xavier entered, having already washed away the worst of the trail dust. He looked different in the confines of the small room, larger somehow, his frontier ruggedness more pronounced against the faded floral wallpaper. "I need to visit the marshal's office," he said without preamble. "Get a feel for who we can trust here. Will you be all right on your own for a bit?" Beatrice nodded. I should organize my documents anyway and perhaps see about acquiring some more suitable clothing. She glanced down at her travel-stained garments with a grimace. Xavier's eyes softened as he crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "You're beautiful no matter what you're wearing." Flatterer, she accused, but leaned into his embrace anyway, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Be careful, Richard has a way of making friends in high places." "I'm just gathering information today," he assured her. "Nothing that would raise alarms." After Xavier left, Beatrice retrieved the oilskin packet she'd kept close throughout her journey. Inside were carefully preserved ledgers and correspondence that detailed Richard's systematic embezzlement from her father's company and several of his other investments. She spread the papers on the small writing desk, reviewing them for what felt like the 100th time. The evidence was damning, but would it be enough? And more importantly, would anyone in Helena care about crimes committed against businesses back east? A soft knock at the hallway door startled her. Hastily gathering the papers and hiding them in the wardrobe, Beatrice called out, "Who is it?" "Maid service, madam," came the reply. "Mrs. Daniels sent up hot water for washing." Beatrice opened the door to find a young woman with a weathered face but kind eyes balancing a large pitcher of steaming water. "Thank you," Beatrice said, stepping aside to let her enter. "Mrs. Daniels thought you might appreciate this after your journey," the maid explained, setting the pitcher on the washstand. "She also wanted me to tell you that if you need any feminine articles or assistance, you need only ask." Her cheeks colored slightly at the direct reference. Touched by the unexpected kindness, Beatrice smiled. "That's very thoughtful. Please thank her for me." The maid hesitated at the door. "Begging your pardon, madam, but are you really Mr. Frost's cousin only?" She stopped, clearly regretting her impulsive question. "Only what?" Beatrice prompted gently. "Only I've never seen a man look at his cousin the way he looks at you," the young woman finished in a rush. "Not judging, madam, just wondering if you might need a friend rather than just hot water." Beatrice considered the woman thoughtfully. Having an ally beyond Xavier might prove valuable, especially another woman who understood the workings of the town. "What's your name?" "Sarah, madam, Sarah Miller." "Well, Sarah, you're right. Xavier and I aren't related. It's complicated." Beatrice hesitated, then decided to trust her instincts. "I'm in Helena on difficult business, and it's safer if fewer people know my true purpose." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "Lots of folks come to Helena with secrets, madam, some running from something, some running to something." She lowered her voice. "If you need anything information, help getting around unnoticed, you just ask for me. My brother works at the telegraph office and my cousin tends bar at the Silver Dollar. Not much happens in this town we don't hear about." "Thank you, Sarah. I may take you up on that offer." Beatrice reached into her small purse and pressed a coin into the maid's hand. "For the extra kindness." After Sarah left, Beatrice gratefully used the hot water to wash away days of trail dust, changing into her cleanest remaining dress. The simple act of grooming restored some of her confidence, reminding her of the determined woman who had fled Boston rather than submit to a life with a man she now knew to be a criminal. Xavier returned as evening was falling, his expression troubled as he entered through the connecting door. "What is it?" Beatrice asked immediately, recognizing the tension in his shoulders. "Richard Blackwell arrived in Helena 3 days ago," he said without preamble. "He's staying at the Grand Hotel and has been meeting with various mining investors and the circuit judge." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. "He's here. How could he possibly know?" "I don't think he does," Xavier interrupted, placing reassuring hands on her shoulders. "From what I gathered at the marshal's office, he's here on previously scheduled business. But his presence complicates things considerably." "I need to move quickly then," Beatrice decided, her mind racing, "before he secures whatever business arrangements he's pursuing. If I can present my evidence to the federal prosecutor tomorrow." "Slow down," Xavier cautioned. "We need to be strategic. Blackwell is already establishing himself as a respectable businessman here. We need to understand who his allies are before we make accusations." Beatrice paced the small room, frustration evident in every step. While we gather information, he's likely destroying evidence and building his defenses. I didn't come all this way to be outmaneuvered again. Xavier caught her hand as she passed, gently pulling her to sit beside him on the edge of the bed. I understand your urgency, truly I do. But rushing in without proper preparation could not only fail to bring him to justice, but might put you in danger. His eyes held hers intently. I won't risk your safety, Beatrice, not even for justice. The fierce protectiveness in his voice melted some of her frustration. What do you suggest, then? Let me do more reconnaissance tonight. There's a poker game at the Silver Dollar where Blackwell is supposed to appear. I can observe without drawing attention. Xavier's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. Meanwhile, you should rest and perhaps write out a formal statement to accompany your evidence. Tomorrow morning, we'll approach the prosecutor together. Beatrice wanted to argue but found his plan sensible. Very well, but promise me you'll be careful. Richard is perceptive and dangerous when cornered. I'm just another dusty cowboy at a poker table, Xavier assured her with a wink. He won't look twice at me. After Xavier left for the Silver Dollar, Beatrice found herself too restless to sleep or even to compose the statement he'd suggested. Instead, she opened the connecting door between their rooms and moved to the window overlooking the street. Helena was alive with activity despite the late hour. Miners fresh from their claims mingled with businessmen and the occasional respectable woman hurrying home. Lanterns illuminated storefronts, and piano music drifted from several establishments down the street. It was while watching this tableau that Beatrice spotted a familiar figure striding purposefully along the boardwalk opposite the hotel. Richard Blackwell, impeccably dressed as always in a tailored suit that set him apart from the frontier residents, was heading in the direction of the Silver Dollar. Beatrice's heart raced. If Richard saw Xavier and somehow recognized him as connected to her, she couldn't take that risk. Without stopping to reconsider, she pulled on her coat and hurried downstairs. The night air was bitingly cold as Beatrice stepped onto the street, her breath forming clouds in front of her. She kept her head down, grateful for the plain bonnet that partially obscured her face. Richard was a block ahead, moving with the confident gait of a man accustomed to commanding attention. Beatrice followed at a distance, uncertain of her plan but determined to ensure Xavier's safety. If she could somehow warn him that Richard was approaching, perhaps he could avoid any interaction altogether. The Silver Dollar Saloon blazed with light and noise, a two-story establishment that seemed to be the center of Helena's nightlife. Richard paused briefly to speak with a well-dressed man outside before entering, the two sharing a laugh that made Beatrice's skin crawl with memories of his false charm. She hesitated outside, suddenly aware of the impropriety of a woman alone entering such an establishment. But concern for Xavier overrode propriety, and she slipped through the batwing doors, immediately pressing herself against the wall to survey the crowded room. The saloon was hazy with smoke and loud with the competing sounds of a piano, raucous laughter, and dozens of conversations. Women in brightly colored dresses circulated among the tables, carrying drinks and batting eyelashes at potential customers. Beatrice scanned the room anxiously, finally spotting Xavier at a table near the back, cards in hand, his expression carefully neutral as he studied his fellow players. Relief flooded her until she realized Richard was making his way toward that very table, greeting men as he passed with handshakes and backslaps like an old friend. Beatrice froze, unsure how to proceed. Any attempt to approach Xavier now would only draw attention to both of them. As she hesitated, a firm hand gripped her elbow. "This ain't no place for a lady," a gruff voice said in her ear. "Unless you're working, which I don't reckon you are." Beatrice turned to find herself facing a mountain of a man with a bushy beard and suspicious eyes. A star pinned to his vest identified him as some kind of lawman. "I'm looking for someone," she began, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ain't we all?" the deputy replied without humor. "But respectable women don't come into the Silver Dollar alone. So either you leave now or I'll have to escort you out. Please," Beatrice lowered her voice. "That man there in the black suit, he's dangerous. I need to warn my friend at the poker table. The deputy glanced where she indicated, his expression changing subtly. Blackwell. He's been meeting with the judge and mayor all day. Seems a proper gentleman to me. He's not what he seems, Beatrice insisted, desperation making her careless. He's defrauded multiple businesses back east, and that's a serious accusation, madam, the deputy interrupted, his grip tightening on her arm. One you shouldn't be making without proof, especially not about a man of Mr. Blackwell's standing. I have proof, Beatrice said quickly. Documents, correspondence, then you should present them through proper channels, not by causing a scene in a saloon. The deputy began steering her firmly toward the door. I suggest you return to wherever you're staying and speak with the marshal in the morning if you have legitimate concerns. As they neared the exit, Richard glanced up from his conversation and looked directly at her. For one terrible moment, Beatrice thought he would recognize her despite the bonnet and plain clothes. His eyes narrowed slightly, but then someone at his table spoke, reclaiming his attention. The deputy escorted Beatrice outside, his manner softening slightly once they were on the boardwalk. Look, madam, I don't know what your quarrel is with Blackwell, but Helena's trying to establish itself as a respectable city. The mayor and business leaders are courting Eastern investors like him. You'll need more than accusations if you want anyone to listen. I understand, Beatrice replied, her mind racing with implications. If Richard had already ingratiated himself with Helena's leadership, her task had just become significantly more difficult. Thank you for your discretion. The deputy tipped his hat. Get yourself back to your hotel now. These streets aren't safe for a lady alone after dark. Beatrice hurried back to the hotel, anxiety gnawing at her with each step. She had potentially made things worse by drawing attention to herself, and she had no way to warn Xavier that Richard might have seen her. When she reached her room, Beatrice paced anxiously, jumping at every sound from the hallway. An hour passed, then another, with no sign of Xavier. Had Richard recognized him somehow? Had there been a confrontation after she left? Finally, near midnight, she heard the soft tread of boots in the hallway, followed by the sound of a key in the lock of the adjoining room. Beatrice rushed to the connecting door, flinging it open just as Xavier entered his room. Thank God, she breathed, relief making her voice shake. I was so worried. Xavier looked surprised to find her still awake. What happened? You look pale as a ghost. I saw Richard heading to the Silver Dollar and I followed him. Beatrice wrung her hands, suddenly aware of how foolish her actions had been. I was afraid he might recognize you somehow, that you might be in danger. Xavier crossed to her in 2 quick strides, taking her hands in his. That was incredibly risky, Beatrice. If he had seen you clearly, I think he might have, she admitted. Just for a moment, a deputy was escorting me out, but Richard looked directly at me. Xavier's expression darkened. Tell me everything. Beatrice recounted her ill-advised venture and the deputy's warning about Richard's connections to Helena's leadership. As she spoke, Xavier guided her to sit on the edge of his bed, keeping her hands clasped in his. I've made things worse, haven't I? She concluded miserably. Not necessarily, Xavier said thoughtfully, but we do need to accelerate our plans. If Blackwell suspects you're here, he won't waste time wondering why. He paused, considering. What I learned tonight confirms your suspicions. He's already investing in several mining operations with money I'd wager isn't his to invest. Did he recognize you? Xavier shook his head. I was just another player at the table. He joined our game briefly, but was more interested in talking to Judge Hammond and a banker named Wilcox. His thumb brushed across her knuckles soothingly. But you're right that we can't take chances now. We'll go to the federal prosecutor first thing in the morning. Beatrice nodded, exhaustion suddenly washing over her now that the immediate anxiety had passed. I'm sorry for being impulsive. Don't apologize for caring, Xavier said gently. He hesitated, then added, you should stay here tonight. If Blackwell is suspicious, he might start looking at hotel registers. Better if you're not alone in your room. The propriety of the arrangement should have concerned her, but Beatrice found she cared far more for safety than convention at this point. All right. They settled into an arrangement similar to their nights on the trail, fully clothed, sharing the narrow bed with Xavier's body, providing warmth and security as Beatrice curled against him. Despite her lingering anxiety, the steady rhythm of his breathing eventually lulled her to sleep. Morning arrived with a knock on Xavier's door, startling them both awake. Xavier motioned for Beatrice to remain silent as he answered. "Telegraph for you, Mr. Frost," a boy's voice announced, "from Black Rock." Xavier accepted the message with a murmured thanks and a coin for the messenger. As he unfolded the paper, his expression grew serious. "What is it?" Beatrice asked once the door was closed. "My neighbor," Xavier explained. "There was a visitor asking questions about me and whether I had company recently." He looked up, meeting her worried gaze. "Described you quite accurately, though he claimed to be your brother looking to reunion you with your family." Beatrice's stomach clenched. "Richard knows I'm here, or at least suspects it, and he knows about you." "We need to move now," Xavier decided. "Gather your evidence while I secure us a meeting with the prosecutor." They moved with urgent efficiency, Beatrice collecting her documents while Xavier went to arrange their meeting. By mid-morning, they were seated in the office of Federal Prosecutor James Harrington, a stern-faced man with shrewd eyes and a reputation for incorruptibility. "I must say, Miss Calloway, these are serious allegations against a man who appears to be bringing much-needed investment to this territory," Harrington said after reviewing her evidence. "What exactly are you hoping to achieve here, Justice, Mr. Harrington?" Beatrice replied firmly. "Richard Blackwell systematically defrauded my father's company and several others. He's using stolen money to build a new empire here in Montana. Those ledgers show transfers that never existed except on paper money diverted to his personal accounts that was meant for business operations." Harrington studied one particular document more closely. "And you say this signature was forged?" "Yes, my father was already ill when that authorization was supposedly given. I was caring for him daily, and I know he signed no such document." Beatrice leaned forward earnestly. "My father built that business from nothing, Mr. Harrington. He wasn't perfect, but he was honest. I cannot allow his legacy to be one of fraud and embezzlement." The prosecutor glanced at Xavier. "And your role in this, Mr. Frost?" "I found Miss Calloway near my property during the blizzard last month," Xavier explained. "After learning of her situation, I offered my assistance in reaching Helena safely. I have no personal grievance against Blackwell, but I've witnessed enough to believe Miss Calloway's claims." Harrington tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the desk. "Ordinarily, I'd suggest you take this to the authorities in Boston, where the crimes allegedly occurred, but given the interstate nature of these transactions and Blackwell's current activities here in the territory," he made a decision. "I'll issue a warrant for his questioning and temporary seizure of his financial records. But I must warn you both, he has influential friends here already." "We understand the risks," Beatrice assured him, "but truth must count for something, even on the frontier." "Truth is a luxury many can't afford, Miss Calloway," Harrington replied grimly, "but I'll do my duty." He rose, indicating the meeting was concluded. "Return to your hotel. I'll send word when Blackwell has been detained for questioning." As they left the prosecutor's office, Xavier took Beatrice's elbow, guiding her through the busy street with a protective air. "You were magnificent in there," he said quietly. "Your father would be proud." Beatrice managed a tense smile. "It's not over yet. Richard won't surrender without a fight." "Neither will we," Xavier promised. They spent an anxious afternoon waiting in Xavier's hotel room, speaking in low voices about what might happen next. Beatrice found herself imagining various outcomes: Richard in handcuffs, her father's name cleared, perhaps even a portion of the stolen funds recovered. But underlying these hopes was a newer, more personal dream, a future with Xavier, away from the complications of her past life. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked, noting her distant expression as she gazed out the window. Beatrice turned to him with a soft smile. "I was thinking about after, when this is finished." And he moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "And I was thinking that I've never felt more alive than these past weeks with you." She looked up at him, allowing her feelings to show plainly on her face. "Even with all the danger and uncertainty, or perhaps because of it, I've discovered parts of myself I never knew existed." Strength I didn't know I had. Xavier's hand found hers, fingers intertwining. You were always strong, Beatrice. You just needed the right circumstances to discover it. Perhaps, she acknowledged, but I also needed the right person to see it in me before I could see it myself. Their moment was interrupted by an urgent knock at the door. Xavier motioned for Beatrice to move aside as he answered cautiously. Sarah, the maid, stood in the hallway, her expression agitated. "Mr. Frost, you need to come quickly. There are men downstairs looking for you and Miss Calloway, not the regular law, but private men. They don't look friendly." Xavier grabbed his coat and hat. "Is there another way out besides the main stairs?" "Service stairs at the end of the hall," Sarah replied, already moving in that direction. "They lead to the kitchen. My brother's waiting with a wagon out back." Beatrice hastily gathered her documents and a small bag with essentials. "What about Mr. Harrington? He needs to know what's happening." "I sent word to the federal building already," Sarah assured her. "My cousin heard at the Silver Dollar that Blackwell was tipped off about the investigation. He's trying to leave town before the warrant is served." They followed Sarah down the narrow service stairs, emerging into a busy kitchen where the staff barely glanced at them, suggesting Sarah had already ensured their cooperation. A door at the rear led to an alley where, as promised, a young man waited with a wagon loaded with supplies. "This is my brother Thomas," Sarah introduced hastily. "He'll take you to our father's cabin outside town. It's not much, but it's secure." Xavier helped Beatrice into the wagon before turning to shake Thomas's hand. "We're in your debt. This is more risk than strangers should take for us." Thomas's resemblance to his sister was striking, though his expression was harder, more wary. "Sarah says you're trying to bring down Blackwell. That's enough for me. His kind think they can buy and sell everything in this territory, including the law." As they settled into the wagon, Beatrice gave Sarah's hand a grateful squeeze. "Why are you helping us?" The maid's eyes flashed with unexpected determination. "Because my fiancé worked for one of Blackwell's mining ventures. When there was an accident last year, Blackwell denied responsibility, claimed Michael was an independent contractor. He died without compensation for his family." Her voice hardened. "Men like that need to face consequences, even way out here." The wagon pulled away just as shouts could be heard from the front of the hotel. Xavier kept one arm protectively around Beatrice as Thomas guided them through back alleys and eventually onto a rough trail leading into the hills surrounding Helena. "What happens now?" Beatrice asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Xavier's expression was grim but determined. "Now we trust that Harrington will do his job and we stay alive long enough for justice to take its course." The Miller family cabin was indeed modest, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with benches, and a pair of narrow beds. But it was solid and hidden within a stand of pines that provided natural concealment. "Father only uses it during hunting season now," Thomas explained as he helped unload their few possessions. "You should be safe here while things settle in town. I'll bring news when I can." After Thomas departed, promising to return the following day with supplies and information, Xavier and Beatrice were left alone with the uncertainty of their situation. Night was falling, and the cabin grew cold despite the fire Xavier quickly built in the hearth. "I've dragged you into danger," Beatrice said softly as they sat side by side on one of the benches, sharing a simple meal of bread and dried meat from Thomas's supplies. "This wasn't your fight." Xavier turned to her, his expression serious in the firelight. "It became my fight the moment I found you in the snow." He took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Besides, I was overdue for some excitement. Ranching can be monotonous." His attempt at humor brought a small smile to her lips. "Somehow I doubt that was the kind of excitement you were seeking." "Maybe not," he acknowledged, "but I wouldn't change a thing about how we met or what's happened since." His thumb traced the delicate bones of her wrist. "Except perhaps your fever, I could have done without seeing you so ill." Beatrice leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I was so afraid when I left Boston, afraid of Richard, afraid of the unknown, afraid I wouldn't be strong enough to see this through." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. I'm still afraid, but it's different now. I'm not alone anymore. No, Xavier agreed softly. You're not alone. The simple declaration hung between them, laden with meaning beyond the immediate circumstances. Beatrice found herself turning more fully toward him, her hand rising to trace the contours of his face, the strong jaw now shadowed with several days' growth of beard, the lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. Xavier, she whispered, her voice catching slightly. If things go badly tomorrow, he silenced her with a gentle finger against her lips. Don't, we'll face whatever comes together. Beatrice caught his hand, pressing a kiss against his palm. That's not what I was going to say. She took a steadying breath. I was going to say that if things go badly tomorrow, I don't want to regret what we didn't share tonight. Understanding dawned in Xavier's eyes, followed quickly by concern. Beatrice, you don't have to, I know I don't have to, she interrupted with newfound boldness. I want to. Not from fear or gratitude or any reason except that I love you, Xavier Frost. I love you and life is uncertain and I don't want to waste a moment more. Xavier's expression transformed, wonder and desire replacing hesitation. I love you too, Beatrice Calloway. More than I thought possible in such a short time. When he kissed her then, it was different from their previous embraces, deeper, more urgent, a promise and a claiming all at once. Beatrice melted into him, her hands threading through his hair as he gathered her closer. They moved to one of the narrow beds, the creaking frame barely accommodating them both as they explored each other with increasing urgency. Xavier's hands were both gentle and insistent as they moved over her body, awakening sensations Beatrice had never experienced. She found herself responding with an instinctive boldness that might have shocked her former self. Are you certain? Xavier whispered against her throat as they paused, breathing heavily, at the threshold of no return. More certain than I've ever been of anything, Beatrice replied, drawing him back to her. Their joining was both tender and passionate, a physical affirmation of the bond that had formed between them through shared danger and growing trust. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, the fire casting golden light across their entwined forms, Beatrice felt a profound sense of rightness despite the uncertainty that still surrounded them. No regrets, Xavier murmured against her hair. Beatrice smiled, pressing a kiss to his chest where his heart beat steadily beneath her cheek. Only that we wasted so many nights on the trail sleeping apart. His laugh rumbled through his chest, and Beatrice savored the sound, storing it away like a treasure against whatever challenges the morning might bring. They dozed fitfully, waking frequently to reassure themselves of each other's presence with touches and whispered words. As dawn approached, Xavier rose to rebuild the fire and check their surroundings, his vigilance never fully relaxing despite the presumed safety of their hideaway. Beatrice watched him move about the cabin, his tall frame silhouetted against the growing light from the window. In just a few short weeks, this man had become the center of her world, his quiet strength and unwavering support as essential to her as breathing. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked, catching her thoughtful gaze as he returned to the bed. "That I never expected to find someone like you at the end of my desperate flight from Boston," Beatrice admitted. "I was only looking for justice, maybe a new beginning somewhere. I wasn't looking for love." Xavier sat beside her, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "The best things in life are often those we weren't looking for." The sound of an approaching wagon interrupted their moment. Xavier immediately tensed, reaching for his rifle as he moved to the window. "It's Thomas," he reported with relief, setting the weapon aside, "and he's not alone. There's a man in a suit with him, looks official." Beatrice hastily dressed, her heart pounding with anticipation and trepidation. Whatever news had brought an official to their hiding place would determine their next steps, perhaps their entire future. When Xavier opened the door, Thomas entered first, followed by none other than Prosecutor Harrington himself, looking travel-worn but triumphant. "Miss Calloway, Mr. Frost," Harrington greeted them with a nod. "I bring news from Helena." "Richard?" Beatrice asked immediately. "In custody," Harrington confirmed. "And most importantly, cooperative. When faced with your evidence and additional documents we seized from his hotel room, he chose to save himself rather than maintain his innocence. Relief washed over Beatrice like a physical force. He confessed. To most of it, Harrington elaborated, accepting the seat Xavier offered at the small table. He's implicated several partners back east in exchange for leniency. Your father's reputation will be fully restored, Miss Calloway, and while the legal proceedings will take time, there's a good chance you'll recover at least a portion of the embezzled funds. Xavier placed a supportive hand on Beatrice's shoulder as she absorbed this information. What about the men who were looking for us at the hotel? He asked. Private investigators Blackwell hired when he suspected Miss Calloway might be in the territory, Harrington explained. They've been detained as well, though they'll likely face no charges. They were simply doing what they were paid to do. So it's over? Beatrice asked, hardly daring to believe it could be resolved so quickly. Harrington's expression grew more serious. The immediate danger, yes. But I must advise you, Miss Calloway, that you'll need to remain in Helena for at least a few weeks while we complete depositions and formal statements. There may also be requirements for you to testify in Boston eventually, though we'll try to handle as much as possible through written testimony. Beatrice nodded, understanding the legal necessities. Of course, I'll do whatever is needed to see justice done. In the meantime, Harrington continued, rising to his feet, you can safely return to town. I've arranged rooms for you at the Grand Hotel, ironically, in the suite Blackwell vacated upon his arrest. A small smile tugged at his lips. I thought there might be some poetic justice in that. After Harrington and Thomas departed, promising to return in a few hours to escort them back to Helena, Xavier and Beatrice stood in the center of the small cabin, the reality of their changed circumstances settling around them. It doesn't feel quite real, Beatrice admitted, her voice hushed. After so many months of running, of looking over my shoulder, Xavier drew her into his arms, his embrace solid and grounding. It's real. You did it, Beatrice. You stood up to him and won. We did it, she corrected, leaning into his strength. I couldn't have done this without you, Xavier. They stood like that for several minutes, simply holding each other as the morning light strengthened around them. Finally, Xavier pulled back slightly, his expression suddenly serious. This changes your situation considerably, he said, a new uncertainty in his voice. With your name cleared and possibly some of your inheritance restored, you'll have options. Boston society would welcome you back. You could rebuild your life there. Beatrice felt a chill at his words and the careful distance in his tone. Is that what you think I want, to return to Boston? Xavier's shoulders lifted in a small shrug that couldn't hide his tension. I wouldn't blame you if you did. The life I can offer is modest in comparison. Xavier Frost, Beatrice said firmly, framing his face with her hands to ensure he met her gaze. Listen to me very carefully. I have no desire to return to Boston or its society. That life nearly suffocated me long before Richard's betrayal. Her voice softened. The only future I want is one with you, whether in a cabin or a mansion or a tent under the stars. Do you understand? The vulnerability in his eyes gradually gave way to hope. You're certain? Life on the frontier is hard, Beatrice. Winters are brutal, comforts are few, and I would choose it 1,000 times over if it means building a life with you, she interrupted. I love you. I want to marry you if you'll have me. I want to learn ranching and maybe start that school I mentioned, and someday have children who know both their letters and how to ride horses like their father. A slow smile spread across Xavier's face, transforming his features with joy. Well then, Miss Calloway, I believe I should make an honest woman of you as soon as possible. Is that a proposal, Mr. Frost? Beatrice teased, her heart so full it felt it might burst. Xavier knelt suddenly, still holding her hands in his. Beatrice Calloway, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? I promise to love you, protect you, and stand beside you through whatever life brings us, for all the days I have left on this earth. Tears filled Beatrice's eyes as she pulled him back to his feet. Yes, Xavier. Yes, with all my heart. When they kissed to seal their promise, it felt like the beginning of something far greater than either of them had dared to hope for when fate first brought them together. 6 months later, on a perfect June morning, Beatrice stood in the doorway of the newly expanded cabin on Xavier's ranch, watching as her husband worked with the spring calves in the corral. The property had transformed in the months since their wedding. A proper barn now stood where there had been only a lean-to. The cabin boasted a second bedroom and a larger kitchen, and construction had begun on a small schoolhouse that would serve both their future children and those of neighboring ranchers. The legal proceedings against Richard had concluded successfully, resulting in the restoration of a significant portion of her father's estate to Beatrice's control. She had used some of the funds to invest in Xavier's ranch, expanding their herd and improving the property, while setting aside the rest for the school and their future security. Xavier looked up from his work, sensing her presence as he always seemed to do. The smile that spread across his face still made her heart skip, even after months of marriage. He set aside his tools and crossed to where she stood, pulling off his gloves as he approached. "Good morning, Mrs. Frost," he greeted her, leaning down for a quick kiss. "You're up early." Beatrice leaned into his embrace, savoring the solid strength of him. "I had some news I couldn't wait to share." Xavier pulled back slightly to study her face, curiosity evident in his expression. "News from Helena." "No," Beatrice said, taking his hand and placing it gently against her still flat stomach. "News from much closer to home." Understanding dawned slowly, then all at once. "Beatrice," his voice was barely a whisper filled with wonder, "are you saying—" "Doctor Sullivan confirmed it yesterday when he passed through," she replied, her own voice thick with emotion. "We're going to have a baby, Xavier, by Christmas if his calculations are correct." Xavier's response was wordless. He simply gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in a joyful embrace that conveyed everything words could not. When he set her down again, there were tears in his eyes. "A child," he marveled, his hand returning to rest protectively over where their baby grew. "Our child. The first of several, I hope," Beatrice said, her own eyes bright with happy tears. "I was thinking perhaps 2 boys and a girl." Xavier laughed, the sound full and rich in the clear morning air. "Planning our family already, are you?" "I like to be prepared," she replied primly, though her smile belied her serious tone. As they stood together in the doorway of their home, looking out over the land that had brought them together against all odds, Beatrice thought of the fevered, desperate woman she had been when Xavier first found her. How close she had come to death in that blizzard, and how completely her life had transformed since that fateful day. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked, his arms still warm around her waist. "I was thinking about how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best," she answered honestly. "If not for Richard's betrayal, I would never have fled Boston. If not for that terrible blizzard, I would never have collapsed near your property. If not for that fever, I wouldn't have had the excuse to keep vigil by your bedside," Xavier finished with a smile. "Though I suspect I would have found some reason to stay close to you regardless." Beatrice laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder as they watched the sun continue its ascent over their land. "I believe you would have, Mr. Frost, and I am profoundly grateful that you did." As the morning air warmed around them, and the promise of their future together stretched out before them like the vast Montana sky, Beatrice silently thanked whatever fate or providence had guided her to this place, this man, this life. The fever that had nearly claimed her had instead led her to a love and happiness beyond anything she could have imagined. And as Xavier gently led her back inside to begin another day of their shared life, Beatrice knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be.